Serafina Vale was standing at the corner of Belmont and Ninth, balancing two grocery bags and a phone wedged awkwardly against her shoulder, arguing with a delivery app about a missing order of dumplings, when she felt it. That strange, prickling certainty of being watched that had followed her everywhere since the night in the alley. She had learned, over the past few weeks, to live with a low hum of paranoia. It sat under her skin the way grief did, quiet most of the time, flaring without warning. She'd stopped taking it seriously days ago, mostly, telling herself it was guilt wearing the costume of instinct. But this time, when she lifted her eyes from the phone and scanned the street out of pure habit, she found him. A man, across the street, half-turned toward a newsstand, doing an unconvincing impression of a person reading a newspaper he clearly had no intention of buying. Dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. And something about the way he stood. Weight shifted slightly onto one leg, shoulders set with the particular, contained stillness of someone trying very hard not to be noticed, snagged at a memory, so old it took her a full 3 seconds to place it. The bag slipped an inch in her grip. The phone slid off her shoulder entirely, and she barely caught it. He looked up at exactly the wrong moment, or exactly the right one, depending on which of them you asked later. And their eyes met across 2 lanes of Calderosa traffic, and one very confused delivery driver honking at a car that had stopped for no visible reason. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he crossed the street. Not quickly, not urgently. He crossed it the way a man walks towards something he has been walking toward, in one form or another, for 9 entire years, and Serafina found herself rooted to the sidewalk, grocery bags digging red lines into her fingers, unable to explain to herself why her heart had started slamming against her ribs before he'd said a single word. "Sorry," he said, stopping a careful, deliberate distance away, hands loose at his sides. "I know this is strange. But have we met before?" Up close, the resemblance was undeniable and impossible at the same time. The line of his jaw, the particular tilt of his head when he was working out whether to say the next thing on his mind. Serafina's mouth had gone dry. "I don't think so," she managed, though even as the words left her, some old and unexamined part of her chest was already arguing with them. He tilted his head, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile pulled at one corner of his mouth, the exact same crooked half-smile she hadn't thought about in 9 years and would have sworn, an hour earlier, she'd forgotten entirely. "Maybe in another life," he said. He didn't know it yet. She didn't know it yet. But somewhere behind his eyes, Lucien Moretti already knew exactly who she was, had known for 11 days, had a folder 3 inches thick documenting her routines, her grief, her possible guilt. And he was choosing, in this exact moment, standing on a street corner with a woman who might have killed his brother, to lie to her face and call it fate. And welcome back to Silver S Dramas. If you're just catching up, go watch part 1 first, because trust me, this next part is going to hit 10 times harder if you know what Lucien already knows and Serafina doesn't. For everyone already caught up, like this video right now, drop a comment telling me if you think Serafina is about to fall for the brother of the man she killed, and let's get into it, because this reunion is not what it looks like. 11 days earlier, Lucien Moretti had sat in a rented office 2 blocks from his father's estate with 3 laptops open and a corkboard behind him that would have looked, to anyone who wandered in without context, like the workspace of a man planning something considerably darker than what he was actually doing. Priya had assembled most of it: timelines, photographs pulled from a dozen public and semi-public sources, a surveillance log that read like the diary of a woman who had, in the space of a single month, transformed herself from a grieving paralegal into something considerably more dangerous. Lucien had read it 4 times. He knew, by now, more about Serafina Vale's daily life than most people knew about their own siblings. He knew she took her coffee black and hated herself for it, buying oat milk every week and never once using it. He knew she still paid the phone bill for a number that had belonged to her sister, apparently unable to let the account lapse. He knew, from 3 separate sources, that she had a habit of humming when she was nervous, an old, tuneless little melody that one of Priya's contacts had picked up on a hallway microphone outside her apartment, and that Lucien had, against every instinct he had for professional detachment, listened to on a loop for longer than he was willing to admit to anyone. "You've read that file more times than the contract for the Singapore shipping deal," Priya observed one evening, setting a coffee down on his desk with the specific, dry disapproval of an assistant who had clocked exactly what was happening several days before her employer had. Which, need I remind you, is worth considerably more than one woman's grocery list. I'm building a case, Lucian said, not looking up. You're memorizing a stranger's oat milk habits. It's relevant. It is deeply, deeply not relevant. Priya leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching him with the fond exasperation of someone who had, over 6 years, earned the right to say exactly what she thought. Lucian, I've known you a long time. I've seen you close 9-figure deals without blinking. I have never once seen you read the same 3 sentences about a woman's coffee order over and over like they're going to rearrange themselves into a confession. He finally looked up. What do you want me to say? I want you to say what's actually true, which is that you don't want her to be guilty. His father called 2 days later, the kind of call Lucian had learned, over 9 years, to dread on principle alone. Any progress? His father asked, without preamble, the particular clipped tone of a man who had never once in his life considered small talk a worthwhile investment. I'm close, Lucian said, which was true in ways he had no intention of elaborating on. Close isn't an answer, Lucian. I have people asking me why my son flew back into this city and hasn't produced a single name in nearly 2 weeks. I'm being thorough. You're being sentimental, his father said, and the accusation landed with more precision than Lucian wanted to admit. I remember exactly how you get when something matters to you more than it should. You got that way about a girl once, a long time ago, and it cost this family a great deal of patience waiting for you to come back to your senses. Lucian's jaw had gone tight enough to ache. This has nothing to do with that, doesn't it? A pause, heavy with the specific, needling patience of a man who had spent decades learning exactly which silences did the most damage. Find her, Lucian. Confirm what we already suspect, and then let the family handle the rest, the way it should have been handled from the beginning, before you decided grief required a more delicate touch. He hung up without saying goodbye, a habit passed down through at least 2 generations of Moretti men, and Lucian sat with the phone in his hand for a long time afterward, feeling the old, familiar weight of a family that had never once, in his entire life, allowed him to simply want something without demanding to know what it cost them. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Priya, satisfied she'd made her point, simply picked her coffee back up and walked out, leaving Lucian alone with a corkboard, 3 laptops, and the particular, unsettled feeling of having just been caught out by someone who knew him better than he currently knew himself. He spent the rest of that evening doing what he always did when a conversation with Priya landed somewhere he didn't want it to. He worked. He cross-referenced timelines. He pulled up, for the 4th time that week, the grainy security photograph that had started all of this, the one showing a woman standing over a shape on wet pavement, and told himself, with the particular discipline of a man who had built an entire company on the strength of not letting emotion cloud a decision, that he was simply doing his job. It didn't work. It hadn't worked in days. Because underneath every professional justification he could construct, there was a much simpler, much less convenient fact sitting at the center of his chest. He wanted, more than he wanted almost anything else in his life right now, for the woman in that photograph to have a version of the story that didn't end with her hands wrapped around whatever had killed his brother. He thought about calling his father, laying out everything he'd found, letting the family machinery he'd spent 9 years running from handle it the way it had always handled things, quickly, quietly, permanently. The thought made something in his stomach turn over, and he hated, more than almost anything else that week, how easily that particular impulse had resurfaced after 9 years of believing he'd left it behind for good. He had not called his father. Instead, at nearly midnight, he found himself scrolling back through the surveillance photographs one more time. Not the ones from the alley, but the older ones, taken over the past 11 days. Serafina buying groceries, Serafina laughing at something on her phone while waiting for a crosswalk signal, Serafina sitting alone on a park bench with her sister's hoodie pulled over her knees like a blanket, staring at nothing, and felt something in his resolve quietly, irrevocably shift. One photograph, in particular, stopped him longer than the rest. It had been taken through a long lens outside Renata's, the very restaurant Dante had favored on Friday nights, and showed Serafina sitting alone at the bar, untouched drink in front of her, watching the door with the specific, coiled stillness of someone working up the nerve to do something she knew was a bad idea. The timestamp put it 3 days after Dante's death. Lucien understood, looking at it, that she had gone there hoping, in some grief-scrambled, irrational way, to find some final piece of her sister's story, and had lost her nerve before she could act on it. It was such a small, human, unremarkable moment of hesitation that it did more to convince him of her humanity than any of Priya's carefully compiled character notes ever could. He would find out the truth, he told himself. But he would find it out as a man who had once loved her, not as a Moretti settling a score. It was, he would later understand, the exact moment he stopped being entirely honest with himself about what he actually intended to do with whatever he found. He had told himself, before the street corner, that he was simply going to observe her, get a read on her in person, confirm or dismiss the wild, improbable theory currently keeping him up at night, that this woman, the prime suspect in his brother's death, was also the girl he had spent 9 years failing to find. That plan lasted approximately 4 seconds after their eyes met across Belmont Street. Because the moment he looked at her, really looked, not through a grainy security photo or a driver's license scan, but at the actual, breathing, grocery bag-holding woman standing on the sidewalk. Every carefully rehearsed line of professional detachment evaporated, and what was left underneath, it was something far simpler and far more dangerous. Recognition, immediate and total, the specific gut-punch certainty of seeing, after 9 years, the one face his memory had never quite let go of. "I'm sorry," Serafina said, taking a small step back, though something in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely sure why she wanted to. Do you have a name?" "Lucien," he said, and then, testing something he wasn't ready to name even to himself, "Lucien Marchetti." It wasn't a total lie. It was, he told himself, the version of his name that belonged to the life he'd actually built. The shipping company, the office 2 states away, the identity that had let him move through the world for 9 years without the specific gravity of Moretti attached to it. It was, he told himself, a technicality. It was also, unmistakably, a lie of omission that would come to cost them both more than either of them could yet imagine. "Serafina," she said, and then, almost against her will, "Vale." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone so quickly she'd have missed it if she hadn't spent the last month training herself to notice exactly this kind of thing in strangers. A habit grief and fear had carved into her whether she liked it or not. But she chalked it up to nerves. Her own mostly. Because there was something happening in her chest right now that felt entirely inappropriate for meeting a total stranger on a street corner, and she didn't have the emotional bandwidth, currently, to examine it too closely. "I have to get these inside before the ice cream melts," she said, lifting one of the grocery bags slightly, an excuse and an anchor at the same time. "But it was nice meeting you." "Weird, but nice." "Weird is accurate," he agreed. And there it was again, that crooked half-smile. And this time she let herself notice how thoroughly it undid something in her chest. She was 3 steps away, halfway down the block, when she turned back almost involuntarily, and found him still standing exactly where she'd left him, watching her go with an expression she couldn't quite name and would spend the rest of the evening trying and failing to stop thinking about. "Okay, if you're already yelling at your screen about that fake last name, good. That means you're paying attention, because that one detail is going to matter a lot more than you think." Comment below if you caught it, and if you're new here, hit subscribe now, because I promise you do not want to miss how this unravels. Grief has a strange side effect that nobody warns you about, which is that it makes you unbearably easy to reach. Serafina had spent a month with her guard fully up against strangers, checking locks twice, walking home with her keys laced through her fingers like something out of a self-defense pamphlet, jumping at shadows that turned out to be nothing more sinister than Mr. Faulkner's cat. But against Lucien, against a man who kept, quite deliberately, arranging to be in the same coffee shop, the same bookstore, the same particular stretch of sidewalk she happened to walk down on her way to work, her guard didn't so much lower as simply forget it had ever been raised in the first place. "This is going to sound insane," she told him, 3 days after the street corner, sitting across from him at a small cafe 2 blocks from her apartment. A coincidence so precisely engineered that only one of them in that conversation knew it wasn't one. "But I keep feeling like I know you. Not in a creepy way." Just familiar. Like déjà vu with a face attached. Maybe you do, Lucien said carefully, turning his coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer, a small, telling nervous habit she would later come to recognize as the closest thing Lucien Moretti had to a tell. Small world. Calderosa's not actually that big, once you get past the skyline. It's not that. She frowned, studying him with the particular intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle they can feel the shape of, but not yet the picture. It's specific. Like, did you ever live on Larkspur? Near the old water tower. Something in his chest went very still. I might have, he said, which was, again, technically not a lie, and technically also the single most cowardly sentence he had said in 9 years. I grew up 2 houses down from a boy who used to climb the garage roof to watch the sunset, Serafina said, half laughing at herself, at the absurdity of even bringing it up, at the sheer improbability of the memory surfacing now, of all moments, over a mediocre latte with a man she'd known for 3 days. We were kids. It's a stupid thing to think about. It's not stupid, Lucien said, and something in his voice had gone quiet enough that Serafina looked up sharply, catching an expression on his face she couldn't quite name. Something raw, something that looked almost like grief, though she had no idea, yet, exactly how many kinds of grief this man was currently carrying at once. You okay? She asked. He recovered fast, faster than she noticed, though not so fast that the moment didn't leave a small, unplaceable residue between them, the specific texture of a conversation that both people sense is circling something neither of them is ready to name. Fine, he said. You just remind me of someone. That's all. That night, after he'd walked her home and left her at her door with a restraint that cost him considerably more effort than he let on, Serafina called the one person she trusted with absolutely everything, her old college roommate Nadia, who now ran a plant shop 3 blocks from Serafina's office and had, over the years, become something between a best friend and an unpaid therapist. Okay, so, hypothetically, Serafina said, phone wedged against her shoulder while she reorganized a spice cabinet that did not, strictly speaking, need reorganizing. If a man gave you actual déjà vu, like, bone deep, this feels like memory déjà vu, would you consider that romantic or would you consider that a red flag? Depends, Nadia said, the sound of a cash register dinging faintly behind her. Does he also give off serial killer energy or just mysterious hot guy energy? Because those overlap more than people want to admit. Nadia, I'm just saying. In my professional opinion as someone who sells succulents to unhinged Calderosa singles 8 hours a day, mysterious is either the best sign or the worst sign, and there is no useful in between. He's not a serial killer. That is exactly what someone dating a serial killer would say. Despite herself, Serafina laughed. A real laugh. The first one that day that hadn't been performed for someone else's benefit, and something in her chest loosened slightly at the sound of her own amusement. He's just different. Kind, but careful. Like he's holding something back. And this is going to sound insane, but there's a version of me that swears I've met him before. In another life, basically. Girl. Nadia's voice had gone suddenly, uncharacteristically serious. You've had the worst month of your entire life. If this man is making you laugh again, I genuinely don't care if he used to be a knight in a past life, or whatever, just be careful. That's all I'm saying. You don't have to fall slow. You just have to fall with your eyes open. Serafina promised she would. She did not, in fact, manage it, but not for lack of trying, and not, as it would turn out, entirely because of anything she did wrong. Their relationship, once it started, moved with the specific, disorienting speed of 2 people who have each independently decided, for entirely different reasons, that they cannot afford to move slowly. For Serafina, it was the first genuinely uncomplicated joy she'd let herself feel since the river, since the alley, since her entire life had folded itself into grief and vigilance and the quiet, corrosive work of building a case against a dead man's cruelty. Lucien made her laugh. Actually laugh, the kind that came from somewhere low in her chest and surprised her every time, with a dry, understated humor that snuck up on you mid-sentence. I have a theory, he told her one evening, 3 weeks into whatever this had become, both of them sprawled on her couch with a truly terrible action movie playing on mute because neither of them could agree on the dialogue being worth listening to. that Mr. Faulkner isn't actually your landlord's employee. I think he's some kind of ancient building spirit who feeds exclusively on complaints about recycling. Do not insult Mr. Faulkner, Serafina said, laughing despite herself, throwing a couch cushion at him with an accuracy that made him raise both hands in mock surrender. He is the closest thing to a father figure this building has, and he will outlive us all through sheer spite. That's exactly my point. He's not human. He's a load-bearing myth. You've met him twice. Twice was enough. He told me, unprompted, an 11-minute story about a dispute over a communal umbrella stand from 2016 that apparently set a precedent. That tracks. There was a Tuesday, 3 weeks in, when he took her to a tiny hole-in-the-wall restaurant 2 neighborhoods over. A place with exactly 6 tables and a chalkboard menu that changed depending on what the owner's mother felt like cooking that day, and made her laugh so hard over a story about his first disastrous attempt at cooking risotto for a business dinner that she had to set down her fork and press a napkin to her eyes. You set off the fire alarm, she gasped, in front of investors. In my defense, nobody tells you butter can do that. Everybody knows butter can do that. I grew up with people who employed other people to know that, he said, and the moment the words left his mouth something flickered across his face. A small, private wince, as though he'd said more than he intended. But Serafina, still laughing, didn't catch it, and he recovered quickly enough that the moment slid past unnoticed. There was another evening, a few days later, when Mr. Faulkner cornered them both in the hallway over a dispute involving a misdelivered package that he had, with total sincerity, decided constituted a federal matter, and Lucien, much to Serafina's delighted astonishment, engaged with the old man's conspiracy theory about the building's mail carrier with such convincing gravity that Faulkner invited him, unprompted, to a strategy session the following week. You have made a terrible mistake, Serafina told him once they were finally back inside her apartment, doubled over laughing. He is going to email you a 17-page document about the Postal Service. I look forward to it. You say that now. He made her feel, for the first time in a month, like a person who was allowed to laugh instead of a woman permanently bracing for the next disaster. And she fell. Quickly, thoroughly, with the specific abandon of someone who has spent so long holding herself together that she'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone else hold part of the weight. What she did not know was that every one of those laughing evenings on her couch was also, simultaneously, a data-gathering exercise for a man who had not yet stopped building his case. That while Lucien genuinely, helplessly enjoyed every single minute of her company, that part, at least, had stopped being a performance somewhere around their second date. He was also, quietly, systematically, doing exactly what he'd come to Calderosa to do. He searched her apartment once. On an evening she'd stepped out to grab takeout, moving through her small, lived-in space with the practiced efficiency of a man who had, in another life, been trained for exactly this. Noting the framed photo of 2 laughing sisters on the bookshelf, the unworn hoodie folded with a specific, protective care that told him more about grief than any surveillance report ever could. The small notebook tucked into a kitchen drawer that he opened, scanned, and returned to its exact original position within 90 seconds. He stood for a long moment in front of that bookshelf photograph before he made himself move on. It had been taken, he guessed, 2 or 3 years earlier. Serafina laughing with her head tipped back, Elara mid-shove against her sister's shoulder, both of them lit gold by whatever late afternoon had produced that particular light. There was nothing in that photograph that belonged in a case file. He knew it even as he cataloged it anyway, some small, compulsive part of him needing to memorize every detail of a life he was simultaneously trying to dismantle and trying, with equal and contradictory intensity, to protect. He found, tucked in the back of a closet, a box of Alera's belongings that Serafina clearly hadn't been able to donate along with the rest. A paint-stained apron, a stack of gallery postcards, a half-finished thank-you note addressed to a curator who'd apparently offered her a job 3 days before she died. He closed the box carefully, squared its corners exactly as he'd found them, and sat back on his heels for a moment with his jaw tight, feeling something in his chest that had nothing to do with evidence gathering at all. He had Priya pull her phone records, quietly, through a contact who owed the Moretti family a favor old enough to have accrued considerable interest. He learned the exact dates she'd called the bartender at Renata's. He learned she'd made 3 calls, in the days before Dante's death, to a number registered under a private investigator's license she wasn't supposed to know the man held. Every new piece of evidence pointed the same direction it always had. And every single time he closed his laptop after another late night confirming what he already knew, he found himself, 20 minutes later, standing outside her door with takeout in his hands and absolutely no memory of having decided to come over. Okay, I need to know. Is anyone else stress eating through this part? Because same. Comment below if you think Lucien's falling for her for real, or if this is all still strategy to him. And make sure you're subscribed, because what he finds next changes everything. The rooftop happened almost by accident, for weeks into whatever this had quietly become between them. Serafina's building had a service door on the top floor that led out onto a flat stretch of tar and gravel nobody officially used, decorated only by a rusted lawn chair someone had abandoned years ago, and a truly heroic amount of pigeon activity. She'd shown it to Lucien on a whim one evening, half joking that it was the worst view in Calderosa, but it's free, and had been surprised to find him go suddenly, uncharacteristically quiet the moment they stepped out into the open air. "You okay?" she asked, echoing, without either of them realizing it, the exact question she'd asked him weeks earlier over coffee. Yeah. His voice had gone rough. He was looking out at the skyline with an expression she couldn't quite place, something caught between wonder and grief, as though the ordinary, unremarkable Calderosa skyline had personally wounded him. "This just reminds me of somewhere. A garage roof. Sunsets." Serafina went very still. "That's oddly specific," she said carefully, watching him with new attention. "Isn't it?" He forced something that was almost a laugh, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Small world, right? You said that yourself, once. Calderosa's not actually that big." She let it go, though something in her chest had tightened in a way she didn't examine too closely, filing the moment away in the same unnamed place where she'd already tucked his familiar jawline, his habit of turning his coffee cup a quarter turn when he was uncomfortable, the particular cadence of his laugh that felt, impossibly, like something she'd heard before she'd ever met him. They sat together on the cracked tar roof until the sun went down entirely, her head eventually finding its way onto his shoulder the exact same way, though neither of them would ever know it. Ilara's had once found its way onto Serafina's on a couch that no longer existed in the same apartment 3 floors below. "Can I ask you something?" she said, into the dark. "Anything. Why does it feel like you're always about to tell me something, and then you don't?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that she almost took the question back. When he finally answered, his voice had gone low and careful, the voice of a man picking his way across something he knew was cracking beneath him. "Because some things take longer to say than other things," he said. "I'm working up to it. I promise you that." She believed him. She had no reason not to. And Lucien, sitting beside her on a rooftop that felt, achingly, like a rehearsal for a life he'd once imagined with her before either of their families had ever taught them what real cruelty looked like, hated himself a little more with every day that promise went unkept. There was one moment, small and easily missed, that nearly ended everything weeks before it actually did. They were at his apartment, a rare occasion, since Lucien had, without ever fully explaining why, always steered their evenings toward her space rather than his, and Serafina had wandered, cup of tea in hand, toward a shelf near his desk while he was in the kitchen. A small, unremarkable box sat there, the kind of thing you'd keep spare change in, and out of pure absent curiosity, she lifted the lid. Inside was a signet ring, heavy and old, engraved with a crest she didn't recognize, a stylized M wrapped in laurel, and beneath it, a photograph so old the color had shifted toward sepia, of 2 boys, one clearly older, standing in front of a house she almost recognized. "What's this?" she called, holding up the ring as Lucien came back in. For one unguarded second, something close to panic crossed his face before he smoothed it away, crossing the room quickly and closing his hand gently but firmly over hers, guiding the ring back into its box. "Family thing," he said. "Old. Complicated. I don't really talk about them." "You never do," she said, not accusing, just observing, the way you note a pattern without yet understanding its shape. "I will," he said. "Soon." It was, she would think much later, the 3rd time he had made her that exact promise, and the third time she had let him get away with not keeping it, because she had already decided, somewhere in the quiet architecture of her own healing heart, that she trusted him more than she trusted her own instincts, and that particular kind of trust, hard-won, desperately needed, entirely unearned, would turn out to be the single most dangerous thing either of them did to each other. The photograph came to him almost by accident. He had gone back to Dante's apartment, a task he'd been putting off for weeks, unable to face the particular grief of sorting through his brother's things, with the excuse, mostly true, that his father needed certain documents for the estate. The apartment had been left almost exactly as Dante had last lived in it, at his father's insistence, as though leaving the scotch bottle on the nightstand and the jacket over the chair could somehow keep the possibility of his return alive a little longer. Lucien moved through the rooms slowly, touching almost nothing, feeling the specific, suffocating weight of grief compressed into furniture and half-used cologne. He found himself, without quite meaning to, in front of Dante's old desk, a heavy, dark wood piece their father had given him for his 21st birthday, ostentatious in the exact way Dante had always liked things. Lucien ran a hand along its underside out of pure habit, an old childhood memory surfacing before he could stop it. Their father, decades earlier, showing a much younger Lucien how to build a false bottom into a drawer, murmuring, with the particular pride of a man passing down a family skill, that a Moretti always keeps one thing nobody else is allowed to find. His fingers found the seam almost immediately. It was there, tucked into a false bottom of a desk drawer Lucien only found because he'd once, as a teenager, watched his own father build an identical one and knew exactly where to press, that he found the file. It was not large. A handful of photographs, a few printed messages, the specific paper trail of a man who had been careful enough to hide something but not careful enough to destroy it entirely. Lucien's hands were unsteady as he lifted the folder free, some old instinct already warning him that whatever was inside was going to change the shape of everything he thought he understood. The first photograph stopped his breath in his chest. It was Alara, younger, laughing, unmistakably alive, caught mid-motion in a way that suggested she had no idea she was being photographed at all, walking down a street, a coffee cup in one hand, dark hair catching afternoon light. On the back, in Dante's cramped, slanted handwriting, 3 words, "She knows." Handle. Lucien sat very still for a long moment, the photograph balanced between 2 fingers, feeling the entire architecture of his understanding of his brother's death shift beneath him. He had come to Calderosa believing his brother was a victim, a man who'd made a wrong choice with a woman, perhaps, but ultimately a man murdered by a stranger's rage. This photograph suggested something considerably darker. His brother had not simply been infatuated with Alara Vale. He had been watching her, managing her, in whatever way that word meant to a man like Dante. And whatever it was she knew, had been enough to warrant a note like Handle, written in the specific, chilling shorthand of a family that had spent generations learning to speak about violence without ever quite naming it. He found the second photograph beneath it. This one was Serafina, standing outside her apartment building, unaware, caught from an angle that made it clear the photographer had been watching her for some time. The paper had begun to yellow slightly at the corners, suggesting it was older than he'd initially assumed. Someone had been watching both sisters. Long before the murder. Long, possibly, before Dante had ever approached Alara at that gallery opening in the first place. Lucien's hands were not entirely steady as he turned the photograph over, and there, beneath Alara's image, in that same cramped handwriting, was a date. He stared at it for a long moment before the significance fully landed, the way understanding sometimes arrives a full beat behind the facts that produce it. It was the exact date Alara had died. He called Priya before he'd even fully processed what he was holding, his voice tight, and clipped in a way she would later say she'd only heard from him twice before in 6 years of working together. "I need everything you can find on anyone who had access to Dante in the 2 weeks before he died," he said, pacing the length of his brother's apartment, the folder clutched in one white-knuckled hand. Associates, family, anyone he would have trusted enough to hand off a job like this. Lucien slowed down. "What did you find?" "He knew," Lucien said, and the words came out rougher than he intended. Grief and fury tangled so tightly together he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. He knew the exact day she was going to die. Priya? That's not obsession. That's not a jealous ex losing control near a river. That's a date circled on a calendar. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. That changes what we're looking for, Priya said finally, her voice gone quiet and careful. If your brother was following someone else's timeline, then whoever handed him that date is the person who actually orchestrated this. Dante might not have been the one in charge of any of it. I know. And Serafina might have killed the wrong man, Lucian said, and the sentence landed in the empty apartment like something physically dropped. Or the right man for the wrong reason. Either way, she has no idea what she actually walked into that night, and neither, apparently, do I. He sat there for a long time after the shock of it settled, the two photographs laid side by side on the desk in front of him. Elara, laughing, alive, unaware. Serafina, watched, unaware, and felt, for the first time since arriving back in Calderosa, the true shape of what he'd actually walked into. This was never simply a story about a woman who had killed his brother in a moment of grief-fueled rage, however much that version had let him carry his anger in a straight, uncomplicated line. This was something with roots that reached back further than the alley, further than the river, further than the gallery opening where Dante had first laid eyes on a girl he apparently already had a file on. Across the city, entirely unaware, Serafina was having a considerably more ordinary evening. Nadia had stopped by unannounced with a bottle of wine and a box of the good chocolates from the shop 2 doors down from the plant store, and the two of them were sprawled on Serafina's couch, Mr. Faulkner's muffled voice audible through the wall delivering what sounded like a 4th or 5th chapter of his ongoing postal service saga to some unfortunate resident who'd made the mistake of answering their door. So, Nadia said, feet propped on the coffee table, wine glass balanced precariously on her knee. Are you going to tell him you love him, or are we doing the thing where you deny it for another 3 weeks while I watch you get progressively more insufferable about a man named after a Renaissance painting? I don't love him, Serafina said, in the exact tone of someone who very much did and had not yet caught up to that fact herself. Uh-huh. I like him. A lot. That's different. Sure. That's why you've reorganized your spice cabinet twice this month for no reason. Very normal, not in love behavior. Serafina threw a chocolate at her, missed by a wide margin, and dissolved into laughter that felt, for the length of that one evening, entirely uncomplicated. A rare, precious hour where she was simply a woman in love, in her own apartment, with her best friend and a slightly too warm bottle of wine, with no idea that 3 neighborhoods away, the man she'd just started imagining a future with was sitting alone in his dead brother's apartment, holding proof that someone had known the exact date her sister was going to die, and had absolutely no idea yet how he was going to tell her any of it. He whispered it to the empty room, the words leaving him before he'd fully decided to say them out loud. What the hell were you hiding, Dante? Outside, the city of Calderosa moved on around him, indifferent and glittering, holding, the way it always had, every secret it had ever swallowed, patiently waiting, once again, to see which one would surface next. Lucian Moretti had not moved from his brother's desk in over an hour, and the 2 photographs in front of him had stopped looking like evidence and started looking like something closer to a confession, not Serafina's. Dante's. He had gone back through the false bottom drawer 3 more times since the first pass, methodically, the way he approached everything once the shock wore off, and on the 4th pass his fingers found a second, thinner folder tucked beneath the first, one he'd missed entirely in the initial wave of grief and adrenaline. Inside were printed messages, no names attached. Only a series of exchanges between 2 burner numbers, the kind of stripped-down, deliberately untraceable correspondence that told its own story before Lucian had even read a word. The first message made his stomach drop. The girl will talk. Beneath it, a reply, sent 4 minutes later. Make sure she doesn't. He kept reading, each new line settling into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. There were nearly a dozen exchanges, spread across the final 6 weeks of his brother's life, all in that same clipped, businesslike shorthand. The vocabulary of men who had learned, across generations, exactly how to talk about violence without ever once using the word. The final message stopped him cold. If Elara refuses to cooperate, deal with her. Lucian sat back slowly in his brother's desk chair, the printed page trembling almost imperceptibly in his hand, and felt the last piece of the story he'd been telling himself, that Dante had been a jealous, cruel man who'd made one catastrophic choice near a river, collapse entirely. This wasn't a man losing control. This was a man following orders. Someone had told Dante to make sure a girl didn't talk. Someone had told him, when persuasion failed, to deal with her. And whoever that someone was, they were still out there, unnamed, unpunished, and very possibly still watching. Dante's death, Lucien understood now with a clarity that made him faintly sick, had never been the beginning of this story. It had been the end of something else, something considerably larger, considerably older, and considerably more dangerous than one obsessed man and one frightened girl. And somewhere in this city, unaware, was the woman Lucien had spent the last month falling in love with, standing directly in the blast radius of a secret she didn't even know existed. Welcome back to Silver S Dramas. If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2 yet, go do that first, because this next part is going to hit completely different once you know what Lucien's holding in his hands right now. For everyone caught up, like this video and drop a comment telling me who you think gave Dante that order, because I promise you, it is not who you think. Let's get into it. He didn't tell Serafina. He told himself, in the days that followed, that this was for her own protection, that dragging her into the middle of an active, unnamed threat before he understood its shape would only put her in more danger, not less. He told himself a lot of things that week, most of them true in the narrow, technical way that let him keep sleeping at night. What he actually did was change, in ways so subtle that Serafina noticed the shift in his behavior before she understood what was causing it. He started walking her home even on nights she hadn't asked him to. He started arriving at her apartment earlier and leaving later, always finding some reasonable, mundane excuse. He'd forgotten his charger. He wanted to see the end of a show they'd started. He just didn't feel like going back to his own place yet. He installed, without asking, a second deadbolt on her door, framing it as a random impulse purchase he'd seen at a hardware store and thought might be nice. A lie so thin that even he winced saying it out loud. "You know," Serafina said one evening, watching him screw the new bolt into place with the focused, unnecessary precision of a man overcompensating for something. "For a shipping executive, you have suspiciously good handyman instincts." "Hidden talents," Lucien said, not looking up from the drill. "Uh-huh. Next you're going to tell me you also know how to hotwire a car. Wouldn't that be a fun thing to know?" She laughed, entirely unaware of how close that joke had landed to something real, and Lucien felt the familiar twist of guilt he'd started carrying everywhere with him lately, a stone in his pocket he touched without meaning to a dozen times a day. He had Priya quietly rotate a car outside her building at night. Nothing obvious, nothing that would spook a professional, just enough presence that if anyone came looking for Serafina Vale with anything worse than curiosity in mind, someone would see them first. He told Priya it was a precaution. Priya, who had known him 6 years and had learned to read the difference between his business voice and every other voice, did not bother pretending she believed that was the whole story. "You know this isn't sustainable," she told him over the phone one night, her own voice carrying the specific weariness of someone managing an operation considerably larger than her employer was willing to admit to. "You can't protect a woman from a threat you haven't identified without eventually having to tell her the threat exists. I know. And you definitely can't keep protecting her from a threat connected to your own family without telling her who you are. I know that too, Priya. Just checking," she said. "Because you're doing a genuinely spectacular job of ignoring both of those facts." His new vigilance did not go entirely unnoticed by the building's other resident authority on all matters of security, either. Mr. Faulkner, who had appointed himself unofficial neighborhood watch captain sometime around the second Obama administration, cornered Lucien in the stairwell one evening with the grave seriousness of a man about to deputize him. "I've noticed the new deadbolt," Faulkner said, squinting at him over his wire-rimmed glasses. "And the car that started parking across the street some nights. Very interesting choices for a man who claims to work in shipping logistics." Lucien, who had spent the better part of a decade negotiating with dockworkers' unions and hostile foreign customs officials without breaking a sweat, found himself, for one absurd moment, genuinely unnerved by a 70-something man in a cardigan. "Just being cautious, Mr. Faulkner." Faulkner did not look remotely convinced. I ran a very tight ship as a building super for 31 years, young man. I know a man watching for trouble when I see one. He leaned in conspiratorially. If you ever need someone to keep an eye on the east stairwell, I am available. I have a system. It involves a clipboard. I'll keep that in mind. See that you do. Faulkner shuffled off, apparently satisfied, muttering something about the Hendersons again, and Lucien stood alone in the stairwell for a long moment, laughing despite himself for the first time in what felt like days. A small, unexpected mercy in the middle of a month that had started asking considerably more of him than he knew how to give. And yet, underneath all of it, the secret surveillance, the guilt, the unread messages sitting in a folder in his car that he couldn't bring himself to look at again. There was a version of that month that was, despite everything, genuinely, achingly happy. They talked about their childhoods properly for the first time. One rainy Sunday afternoon spent entirely on Serafina's couch, a pot of tea going cold between them, rain streaking sideways down the windows in a way that made the whole apartment feel like the inside of a snow globe nobody had shaken in a while. My mother used to take Alara and me to every free museum exhibit in the city, Serafina said, legs tucked underneath her, a mug cradled in both hands. Every single one. Didn't matter what it was, dinosaur bones, modern sculpture, some very confusing exhibit about the history of the zipper. She'd make up these elaborate backstories for every single painting. Like, completely invented. This woman is clearly hiding a secret twin. This man definitely owes someone money. Alara used to write them down in a notebook like they were fact. That's where she got the museum thing then. Probably. Something soft and sad crossed Serafina's face, there and gone. She used to say she wanted to be a curator specifically so she could write the real placards, but make them as unhinged as Mom's version. I used to tell her nobody would hire a curator who wrote, "This man definitely owes someone money," on an actual museum wall. I don't know, Lucien said quietly. I think that placard would get more foot traffic than half the ones in actual museums. That surprised a real laugh out of her, bright and unguarded, and Lucien felt it land somewhere warm in his chest even as the guilt sat right beside it, the two feelings coexisting now with an ease that frightened him more than either one alone. What about you? She asked. You've heard approximately 400 stories about my childhood and told me almost nothing about yours. Something in Lucien went very still, the way it always did when the conversation drifted anywhere near this particular cliff edge. Complicated family, he said, which was, as always, technically true. Not a lot of museum trips. More like, a lot of very serious men in a lot of very serious rooms, and me trying to figure out early on that I didn't want to be one of them. Is that why you left? Whatever it was you left. Partly. He turned his mug a quarter turn on the coffee table, the old nervous habit she'd long since learned to recognize. Partly it was a girl. Serafina's eyebrows went up. Oh, a long time ago, he said, and something in his voice had gone rough enough that she didn't push further, filing the moment away with all the others. The rooftop, the ring, the flicker behind his eyes that first day on the street corner, into that same quiet, unexamined place in her chest where she was slowly, without quite admitting it to herself, assembling a picture she wasn't ready to look at directly yet. You disappearing on people seems to be a theme, she said instead, lighter, though there was a real edge of hurt underneath it that she hadn't quite planned on letting show. For what it's worth, whoever that girl was, I hope she's not still waiting on an explanation. Waiting on someone who disappears is its own particular kind of awful. I know, because, she stopped herself. Because what? Nothing. Old stuff. She shook her head, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Your disappearing thing just, it hit closer to something than I meant it to. That's all. Lucien reached over and took her hand, guilt and tenderness knotting together so tightly in his chest he could no longer separate them. I'm not going anywhere, he said, and meant it with an intensity that startled even him. A promise he had absolutely no idea, in that moment, whether he'd actually be able to keep. There were other afternoons that month, smaller and quieter, that Serafina would look back on later as some of the happiest of her life, without ever quite being able to explain why, given everything she'd eventually learn about what was happening underneath them. There was the Saturday they spent entirely lost in a second-hand bookstore 3 neighborhoods over, Lucien reading her increasingly dramatic excerpts from a truly terrible 1970s romance novel he'd found in the bargain bin, doing voices for both characters with a commitment that had Serafina laughing so hard the store's elderly owner came over twice to check they were both all right. There was the evening Faulkner did, in fact, follow through on his threatened strategy session, cornering the two of them in the lobby for 45 increasingly baffling minutes about a suspected conspiracy involving the building's recycling schedule, during which Lucien took notes with a straight face so convincing that Serafina had to excuse herself to the bathroom twice just to laugh, without being rude. "You are unbelievable," she told him afterward, once they'd finally escaped up the stairs. "You had a whole notepad out. You were nodding." He raised some genuinely compelling points about Tuesday pickup versus Thursday pickup. There were no compelling points, Lucien. There is no conspiracy. Waste management is not surveilling this building. That's exactly what someone involved in the conspiracy would say. She'd thrown a couch cushion at him for that one too, and he'd caught it this time, laughing, and pulled her down onto the couch beside him. And for a little while, a whole, uninterrupted little while, neither of them thought about anything at all except how easy this had become, how frighteningly natural, like something they'd both been rehearsing for years without knowing it. Okay, that handhold just wrecked me a little, not going to lie. If you're rooting for these two despite literally everything stacked against them, comment Team Lucien and Serafina below, because I need to know I'm not alone in this. Stick with me. We're getting to the part that changes everything. It was somewhere in the middle of that same golden, guilt-shadowed month that Lucien made the decision that would end up costing him the most. He drove out to the small storage facility where Priya kept the physical case files, the surveillance logs, the printed phone records, the growing folder of evidence that had once been the entire reason he'd come back to Calderosa, and stood in front of the locked unit for nearly 20 minutes before he made himself open it. He didn't destroy anything. That would come later, and it would be a mistake he regretted almost immediately. What he did, that afternoon, was close the file. Not literally. He left everything exactly where it was, undisturbed. Evidence still evidence. But something in him, some engine that had been running non-stop since he'd landed back in this city, simply switched off. "I don't need to know anymore," he told Priya that evening. The two of them standing in his rented office beneath the corkboard that had once felt like the entire architecture of his purpose here. Not like this. Not built entirely around proving what she did or didn't do. "Lucien, I know what I found in that drawer," he said. "I know someone gave Dante an order, and I know that whatever Serafina did, she did it because a system that was supposed to protect her sister failed at every single turn. I've read her file more times than I can count, Priya. I know exactly who she is. Grief didn't make her dangerous. It made her the only person in this whole mess who actually tried to do something." Priya studied him for a long moment, arms crossed, her expression unreadable in the particular way it got when she was deciding how much honesty a given moment could actually bear. "And the bigger threat? The one that gave the order?" "I'll find it," Lucien said. "I'll find it as the man protecting her, not as the man building a case against her." He exhaled, and something in his shoulders loosened for the first time in weeks, a decision finally made after a month of circling it. "I choose her, Priya. Whatever that costs me with the family. I'm choosing her." Priya was quiet for a moment, studying him the way she might study a contract she suspected had a clause buried somewhere in the fine print. "You know what your father's going to say if he finds out you've stopped actively building a case against the woman he's convinced killed his son. I know. You know what happens to people who disappoint your father, Lucien. I've watched it happen. It's not usually loud. It's just permanent. I know that too." He met her eyes, steady despite everything underneath it. "I spent 9 years building a life specifically so that man's disappointment couldn't touch it. I'm not going to let it start touching it now, over the one thing in 9 years that's actually made me happy." Priya held his gaze a moment longer, then something in her posture softened, the professional caution giving way, just slightly, to something more personal. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I've never seen you like this. Not once in 6 years. I hope it's worth whatever it ends up costing you." "So do I," Lucien said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything else in a very long time. It would turn out to be one of the most genuinely happy nights of his life. That particular evening, the two of them ordering too much food, arguing cheerfully about a movie neither of them could agree on, Serafina falling asleep against his shoulder halfway through, entirely unaware that on the other side of the city, a decision had just been made that would, within 72 hours, blow the entire fragile architecture of their happiness apart. What Lucien didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, sitting in the warm afterglow of a decision that had felt, that night, like the bravest thing he'd done in 9 years, was that his father had already noticed the shift in him too, from a considerably greater distance, and had drawn his own conclusions. He's gone quiet, his father told the two men seated across from him in the study, men whose names appeared nowhere on any official family document, but whose presence in that room told its own story about exactly what kind of quiet the elder Moretti was used to purchasing. No updates in a week. No names. My son is supposed to be finding his brother's killer, and instead he's renovating some woman's apartment. You want us to move on her directly? One of the men asked, his tone as flat and procedural as a man discussing shipping logistics rather than a human life. No. His father's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the room he was sitting in. Not yet. My son needs a reminder of what's actually at stake here. Something that reaches him without my name attached to it. Let him think someone else is watching. Let him feel exactly how exposed he's made himself. And if that doesn't work, the silence that followed answered the question more completely than any words could have. None of this reached Lucien, of course. Not that week, not for weeks after. He remained, in the days following his decision, blissfully unaware that the very family he'd spent 9 years trying to outrun had already begun quietly circling back into the center of his life, disguised as nothing more than an anonymous envelope and a photograph he would have no way of tracing back to the one place he'd never think to look. The package arrived on a Tuesday, delivered to Lucien's rented office by a courier who couldn't later describe the sender beyond a guy, normal-looking, paid in cash. There was no note, no name, just a plain manila envelope, slightly worn at the corners as though it had traveled through several hands before reaching his, and inside it, a single photograph. Lucien's fingers went cold the moment he pulled it free. The image was blurry, taken from a distance, in low light, the kind of photograph shot in a hurry by someone who hadn't wanted to be noticed taking it. But there was no mistaking what it showed. A dim alley, a shape on the ground, and standing over it, chest heaving, one hand pressed to her own mouth in visible shock, a woman with long dark hair he would have recognized anywhere in the world, in any lighting, at any distance. Serafina. He sat with the photograph in his hands for a long time, feeling something in his chest cave slowly inward, like a floor giving way one board at a time. He had known, technically, that this evidence existed, had known it from the very first grainy security photo his father slid across a desk weeks ago. But knowing it in the abstract, as a fact in a file, was nothing like holding hard, undeniable proof in his own hands, mailed anonymously by someone who had apparently been sitting on it, waiting, for reasons Lucien couldn't begin to guess at. Why now? Why send it now, weeks after the murder, weeks into a relationship that anyone watching closely enough to have this photograph would surely have noticed? The answer, when it came to him, was so simple and so ugly he almost couldn't make himself think it all the way through. Someone had been watching. Not just Dante's activities, not just Alara. Someone had been watching Lucien too, closely enough to know exactly when a photograph like this would do the most damage. Not to a police investigation, not to some abstract question of justice, but to him, personally, at the precise moment he had let himself become vulnerable enough for it to actually hurt. This wasn't evidence. This was a message. And whoever had sent it wanted him to know they were still out there, still watching, still entirely capable of reaching directly into the middle of his life and detonating it whenever they chose. He called Priya immediately, his voice tighter than he intended. "I need you to find out who could have known I'd be at this office today," he said, pacing a tight circle in front of his desk, the photograph face down now, as though not looking at it might undo what he'd already seen. This wasn't sent to my father's estate. It wasn't sent to the family lawyers. It came here, to an address almost nobody has. That's a very short list of people, Priya said carefully. I know. Which means whoever sent it either has access to information your own family doesn't widely share, or it's someone inside the family, Lucien finished. the sentence landing in the empty office with the weight of something he hadn't let himself consider until he heard himself say it out loud. Someone who already knew exactly where to find me. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Lucien could hear, faintly, the sound of Priya setting something down. A pen, a cup, something deliberate, the small physical pause of a person recalibrating an entire theory of a case in real time. If that's true, she said finally, then this was never really about Serafina at all. She's just the leverage. Someone is using her to get to you. Lucien closed his eyes, feeling the full, dizzying scope of what that meant settle over him. That the woman he loved might not be the target of this at all, but simply the fastest, most effective way for someone to reach a man who had spent 9 years making himself very difficult to reach any other way. If you just felt your stomach drop, welcome to the club, because Lucien just found out he's not the only one who knows Serafina's secret, and whoever sent that photo is not done. Comment below who you think sent it, and hit subscribe, because the next scene is the one this entire story has been building toward. At the exact same hour, Lucien was staring down at a photograph that would end up changing everything. Serafina Vale was sitting on the edge of her bathtub, staring at a small plastic stick balanced across 2 shaking fingers, feeling something bloom in her chest that she hadn't felt in over a month. Pure, uncomplicated, disbelieving joy. She had suspected for about a week, in the vague, half-convinced way you suspect things you're too afraid to actually confirm. The exhaustion that hit differently than grief exhaustion. A strange new aversion to the smell of coffee that had briefly made her wonder if she was coming down with something. She'd bought the test 3 days ago and let it sit unopened in the bathroom cabinet, needing, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, to be completely alone the first time she looked at the result. 2 lines. Unmistakable, permanent, entirely real. She pressed a hand over her mouth, half laughing, half crying, staring at herself in the bathroom mirror like she was meeting a stranger for the first time. A version of herself standing on the very edge of a future she hadn't let herself imagine in weeks, not since grief had swallowed every plan she'd ever had for her own life. A baby. Lucien's baby. For one brief, involuntary moment, grief and joy collided in her chest so hard it nearly knocked the breath out of her. The thought of Alara arriving unbidden, the way it always did lately at the edges of anything good, a sharp pang of missing her sister so completely that it felt almost physical. Alara would have been unbearable about this. She would have shown up within the hour with an armful of the ugliest, most sentimental baby gifts she could find within a 3-block radius, already narrating an entire imagined future in that breathless, runaway way she narrated everything, already assigning herself the role of favorite aunt before the ink on the test had even dried. Serafina let herself cry for a moment, there on the edge of the bathtub, missing her sister so fiercely it ached, and then, carefully, deliberately, let the tears turn back into something closer to gratitude. Alara would have wanted her to be happy about this. Serafina decided, sitting there, that she was going to let herself be. She thought, with a rush of tenderness so sudden it nearly buckled her knees, of how he would look holding it. This careful, guarded, endlessly gentle man who turned his coffee cup a quarter turn when he was nervous and had somehow, without her fully noticing it happening, become the person she trusted more than anyone left alive in the world. She wanted to tell him immediately, not over the phone, not in some rehearsed speech. She wanted to see his face the exact moment he understood, wanted to memorize it the way you memorize the good moments, instinctively, because some part of you already suspects there won't be enough of them. She called Nadia first, because some things you simply cannot hold entirely alone, even for an hour. Okay, you need to sit down, Serafina said, pacing her bedroom, phone pressed hard to her ear, unable to keep the grin out of her voice. I'm literally elbow deep in repotting a fiddle leaf fig. Sarah, what is happening? I'm pregnant. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by the unmistakable clatter of a woman dropping an entire bag of potting soil on a shop floor. Shut up, Nadia said, somewhere between shouting and sobbing. Shut up, are you serious? Sarah, I'm serious. Does he know? Oh my God, does Lucien know? Not yet. I want to tell him tonight. In person. Serafina pressed a hand flat against her own stomach, The same instinctive gesture she'd find herself repeating 100 times over the coming days without ever quite noticing she was doing it. I want to see his face. You're going to make an old plant lady cry in the middle of her own shop, Nadia said, voice thick. Go. Go tell him. Text me the second it happens. I mean it, Sarah, the second. Serafina hung up, still smiling, tucked the test carefully into her bag like something precious and breakable, and headed out into the golden late-afternoon light toward Lucien's apartment, utterly unaware that 3 neighborhoods away, the man she was about to hand the best news of her life to was sitting alone in a dim office, staring down at a photograph that proved, beyond any doubt, exactly what she'd done in that alley 6 weeks ago. She took the long way there, unable to stop smiling at absolutely everyone she passed. A jogger, a woman walking a small, indignant-looking dog, a delivery driver who gave her a startled but pleased look when she wished him a good evening entirely unprompted. The city felt different somehow, softer, dressed up in that particular amber-like calderosa only really got in early autumn, and she found herself rehearsing, half out loud, the exact words she wanted to say when she finally stood in front of him. I have something to tell you. Too dramatic. You're going to be a father. Too blunt, though she liked it more each time she tried it out. I think we're going to need a bigger apartment. That one made her laugh out loud on the sidewalk, drawing a curious glance from a stranger, and she decided, grinning, that she'd figure out the exact words when she was standing in front of him and could watch his face while she said them. Some things, she thought, you don't rehearse. You just let yourself feel them out loud, in real time, and trust that the person you love will catch whatever you throw. She had absolutely no way of knowing how differently that particular metaphor was about to play out. By the time Serafina let herself into his apartment with the spare key he'd given her 2 weeks earlier, a small, ordinary gesture that had felt, at the time, like one of the biggest of her life. The sun had gone down entirely, and the apartment was dark. Lucien, she called, setting her bag down by the door, still smiling, still holding the whole bright weight of her secret carefully against her chest. You home? No answer. A thin line of light showed beneath the bedroom door. She crossed toward it, humming without realizing she was doing it. That same old, tuneless little melody, her hand already reaching for the doorknob, her heart already rehearsing the exact words she wanted to say first. She pushed the door open. The room was dark, except for the thin blade of moonlight cutting through the half-closed curtains. Lucien sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, head bowed, and it took her a full second, one bright, oblivious, still happy second, to notice the photograph in his hand. Lucien, she said, and she was smiling as she said it, still entirely inside the golden bubble of her own news, already crossing the room toward him. I have to tell you something. I've been dying all day. He lifted his head. Whatever Serafina had been about to say died somewhere in her throat. His eyes, when they found hers, held none of the warmth she'd spent the last month falling in love with. They were flat and cold and unfamiliar in a way that made every hair on her arms rise at once. He said nothing. He simply held up the photograph, turning it slightly so the moonlight caught its surface, and Serafina's entire body went still as she recognized, even from across the room, even in the dim light, exactly what it showed. Her smile disappeared. Lucien, she said again, and this time his name came out entirely different, smaller, frightened, the sound of someone realizing, in real time, that the ground she'd been standing on had never been as solid as she believed. He didn't answer. He set the photograph down on the bed beside him, slow and deliberate, and reached instead for something resting on the nightstand, something that caught the moonlight in a cold silver line as he lifted it. A gun. Serafina's breath caught entirely. Come here, Lucien said, and his voice was quiet, and even, and utterly unrecognizable. She didn't move. Behind her back, one hand had found its way, without her permission, to press flat against her own stomach. The same private, instinctive gesture, the same secret still folded inside her that she'd been carrying across the city all evening, desperate to give him, and had no idea, standing frozen in that doorway, whether she would ever get the chance to now. Come here, Lucien said, and Serafina did not move. The gun stayed low in his hand, pointed at nothing, but its presence filled the room anyway, the way a held breath fills a chest. Long seconds passed before he set it down on the nightstand, and something in Serafina's shoulders loosened a fraction, though the fear did not leave her eyes. "Sit down," he said instead, gesturing to the chair across from the bed, his voice stripped of every warm thing she'd spent a month falling in love with. She sat. He held the photograph out toward her, angled so the moonlight caught it fully. "Do you know this man?" Serafina's whole body went cold. She knew that face, knew it from an alley, from a river, from every version of grief she'd carried for 2 months. But what stopped her breath entirely wasn't the photograph. It was that Lucien had asked the question at all. Not what happened. Not who is this. He'd asked if she knew him, in a voice that already had its answer. She looked up at him instead of down at the photo. "Where did you get that?" It was the wrong question to ask, and she knew it the instant it left her mouth. A woman with nothing to hide asks who the man in the photo is. A woman who recognizes him instantly, who skips straight past the introduction to the far more dangerous question of, "How do you have this?" That woman has already answered him completely, without saying a single incriminating word. Lucien's jaw tightened. He'd hoped, somewhere underneath all the evidence, that she would ask him who Dante was. She hadn't, and that told him more than any file Priya had ever handed him. This is it, the part everything has been building toward. If you haven't watched parts 1, go catch up now, because none of this is going to land the way it should otherwise. For everyone here, like this video, and get ready, because we are finally getting the truth. Let's go. "Where were you that night?" Lucien asked, and his voice had gone quiet in the particular way that was somehow worse than shouting. "Home," Serafina said. "I was home." It was a lie, and they both knew it. And for one terrible moment the lie sat between them like a third person in the room. Lucien didn't call her on it. He simply asked the next question, and the one after that, watching her build a version of that night out of careful, contradictory pieces that fell apart the moment he pushed on them. A story about staying in, then a story about a walk, then silence, because she had run out of places to put the lie. "You're not asking me what happened," she finally said, watching him with new, sharpening attention. "You're testing me. You already know I'm lying." "I do. Then why keep asking?" "Because I wanted to hear how far you'd go to protect it," Lucien said, and something in his voice cracked open just slightly, grief and fury and something that still, impossibly, sounded like love all tangled together. "And because some part of me was hoping you'd tell me the truth before I had to tell you mine." "Your truth," Serafina repeated slowly, something cold sliding down her spine at the word. "What does that mean?" "It means I've known who you are for over a month," he said. "Longer than that, actually. I knew who you were before I ever crossed that street." She stared at him, the room seeming to tilt slightly. "The street corner. Have we met before? Maybe in another life?" Her voice had gone flat with disbelief. "That was a performance." "No," Lucien said, and for the first time his own composure slipped, something raw showing underneath it. "It wasn't. That's the part one need you to understand before anything else. None of what happened between us was a performance. Not the rooftop. Not the bookstore. Not any of it. I came here to find out what really happened that night, and instead I fell in love with you all over again. And I have spent every single day since trying to figure out how both of those things could possibly be true at once." It was the word mind that did it. Serafina sat back, and the pieces she'd been holding separately for weeks, his strange questions, his disappearances, the deadbolt he'd installed without asking, the ring in the box he'd snatched back so fast, the flicker behind his eyes on a street corner 9 years in the making. All of it slid into place at once, fast and sickening, like a photograph developing too quickly. "You've been investigating me," she said slowly. "This whole time." Lucien didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Since the beginning?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "The street corner. That wasn't an accident, was it? You knew who I was before you ever said a single word to me." Still, he said nothing. But he crossed to a drawer, pulled out a second photograph, and set it on the bed between them without a word. An old one, slightly faded, 2 boys standing in front of a house she suddenly, dizzyingly recognized. One of them was Dante. Younger, gap-toothed, laughing at something out of frame. The other was Lucien. Serafina stared at it for a long moment, the room tilting slightly around her. "That's—" she started, and couldn't finish. Lucien said nothing. "That's your brother?" He still didn't answer, but he didn't need to. His silence was its own confession, and Serafina felt the last month of her life rearrange itself completely around a single, devastating fact. The man she loved, the man she'd let hold her while she cried about her sister, the man whose child she was carrying. He was the brother of the man she'd killed, and he had known it since the very first time he'd crossed a street to reach her. In the middle of everything, the shock, the grief, the sheer vertigo of it, Serafina's hand found her bag on instinct, fingers closing around the small plastic test still tucked inside. The secret she'd walked here to give him as a gift, and was now terrified to let him see it all. Lucien noticed the movement. "What is that?" "Nothing," she said, too fast, sliding it back down into the bag. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his exhausted, grief-worn face told her he knew she was lying about this too. One more secret in a room that had suddenly become entirely built out of them. But he didn't push. Whatever it was, it would have to wait behind the much larger thing currently sitting between them on the bed. "I need you to tell me what actually happened that night," Lucien said quietly. "Not for evidence. Not for my father. Not for anyone but me. I need to understand what my brother did to make you do this." Serafina looked at him for a long moment, weighing every version of the truth she could give him, and found, in the end, that she couldn't do it yet. Not with the second secret still sitting in her bag. Not with the wound between them still this raw. "Not tonight," she said. "I will tell you everything. I promise you that. Just not tonight." To her surprise, he nodded and didn't push. For a while, neither of them spoke. The anger had nowhere left to go, and underneath it, impossibly, something softer kept trying to surface, his hand, at one point, reaching halfway toward hers before he caught himself. Hers, reaching back before she remembered why she shouldn't. Two people who loved each other, sitting in the wreckage of everything they'd built on a lie neither of them had told on purpose. It would be days before either of them could name what happened next as anything other than desperation. A fragile, temporary truce, an afternoon spent simply being two people who still loved each other before the rest of the story caught up with them again. Neither of them talked about Dante. Neither of them talked about the file, or the family, or the child Serafina still hadn't found the courage to mention. For one afternoon, they simply let themselves have each other, quietly, tenderly, both of them fully aware it might be the last time. The message arrived 2 days later, while Serafina was in the next room. Lucien's phone buzzed once, a number he didn't recognize, no name attached. "You think she killed your brother because of her sister? You're wrong." He stared at it, pulse spiking, and typed back nothing. Because there was nothing to say to a stranger who clearly knew more about his own life than he did. A second message followed before he'd even set the phone down. Attached to it, a photograph. Dante, unmistakably, standing beside someone whose face made Lucien's stomach drop through the floor. Someone close to the family. Someone who had sat at his father's table more times than Lucien could count. He didn't have time to process it. He heard the bedroom door open behind him. He turned the phone face down instinctively. The old habit of a man who had spent 9 years learning to hide things reasserting itself before he'd even thought about it, and looked up to see Serafina standing in the doorway, still holding the small plastic test she'd finally worked up the courage to bring back out. Her expression caught somewhere between fear and resolve. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I've been trying to find the right moment for 2 days, and I don't think there's ever going to be one, so I'm just going to say it." Then she saw his face. Whatever warmth had lived there over the last 2 fragile, stolen days was gone, replaced by the same cold, unreadable stillness she now understood was the one thing every Moretti man learned before anything else. She saw the second photograph still open on the bed. She saw the gun, back in his hand. He rose slowly. The woman he'd loved as a child. The woman he'd spent 9 years searching for. The woman he'd secretly investigated, and chosen anyway, and was now looking at like a stranger holding the answer to every question that had ever mattered. His voice, when it came, had broken entirely open. "Why did you kill my brother?" And that's the question this whole story has been building to. Serafina finally has to decide what to tell him. The truth about Dante, the truth about Alara, the secret she's still holding in her other hand that could change everything, if she ever gets the chance to say it. What do you think she says first? Comment below, and thank you for staying with this story from the very beginning. This is Silver S Dramas. I'll see you in what comes next.